Welcome to the United Way Difference, featuring Oshkosh area United Way agencies and events. Your host for the United Way Difference is Executive Director Sue Ponick.
Hi, and welcome to the United Way Difference. I'm Sue Ponick, and my guests today are Stu Rickman, President of United Way, and Karen King, who is an independent consultant who worked on a project for us called Women, Poverty, and Economics. And we're going to talk today about that project and what it means for women in our community. So thank you both for being here.
Thank you,
Pleasure.
Sue.
Okay, Stu, we're going to start with you. Why did United Way decide on the issue of women, poverty, and economics?
Well, it was a result of some study that the board of directors did. We were challenged by a past president to identify a topic or an issue in the community where United Way could have a significant impact and could allocate some additional resources to resolving. And as we looked at some preliminary research, it was pretty clear to the board that the issue of women, poverty, and economics was an issue that the United Way could have an impact on if we could galvanize the community to come together and bring resources to bear. And I think that, you know, as we started doing our research, one of the most startling statistics in my mind that we came across indicated that as of 2010, the gap between women in poverty was double that of men in poverty. In other words, single women, households headed by single women, 31.6% compared to 15.8% of households headed by single men. So there's a big disparity there in women who are in poverty with independent children at home. And we felt that was something that could be addressed and should be addressed in our community.
Were there any other statistics that kind of bared that out at all?
Well, if you look at women in poverty in its totality, not just focusing perhaps on single women with dependent children, we found that elderly women are more likely to be poor than elderly men by a difference of 13% of women as opposed to 6% of men who are over 75. So there again, the differentiation is quite stark and quite dramatic. And there are certain age groups that are affected more than others. The poverty gap between men and women widens between the ages of 18 and 24, and then again over the age of 75. And also, women of color have a higher likelihood of being poor than white women do.
So, I mean, part of the job that we had to do was to try to find more facts, maybe. I mean, those were 2008 and 2010. 2010 would be the most recent census statistics.
That's correct.
But is there anything more recent than that? And maybe more local, because those were national statistics.
Right. You know, one of the things that we came across is that to really localize it, Winnebago County has a poverty rate that's 3.7% larger than across the state as a whole. So Winnebago County is feeling the poverty pinch maybe more than other counties.
And that fact is men and women.
Men and women, correct.
Right.
Correct. And you know, contrary to popular belief, we see unemployment rates falling. More people are working, but we don't see a corresponding reduction in poverty. In fact, poverty rates in Wisconsin actually rose between 2012 and 2013. So more people are working, but we're not closing the poverty gap like you would expect we would.
And you would automatically think that there would be a corresponding relationship there,
Right.
that once employment got better, poverty would get lower.
And it may be an indicator that people who are going to or finding jobs are finding minimum wage jobs in the service sector perhaps, and it still leaves them in a situation of being in poverty.
Okay, Karen, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, Wisconsin certainly has been creating new jobs, but they have fallen into this lower pay, minimum wage, no benefits category. So you do see more people working, but the poverty rate stays about the same, even though some are working several jobs in order to reach their level of living.
Okay. Are we done with the facts yet, or do we have a few?
No, we can
We can go on indefinitely.
we can really document poverty in our state.
Absolutely.
In Wisconsin, the poverty rate for women is 14.4%. And if you want to look at the national wage comparison, the gap is closing on the wage differentiation, but not significantly quickly over the course of years.
Now, is that the wage differentiation between men and women, between the races?
All of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. If you look at it from the standpoint of women's earnings.
Now, we're apologizing for the slide that's on the screen because the graph is really small, but it's as big as we could get it.
Okay.
So Rick Stu will tell you what the numbers mean.
In 1974, women's annual earnings were 15% of men's annual earnings, or for every dollar a man made, a woman was making 59 cents. Now, if you fast forward it to 2014, the differentiation is 79% compared to men.
So we gained 20 cents.
And it does.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem very fast. I remember when I was in graduate school, when I was a young woman in the workforce, we certainly had every expectation that this number would be much higher by now. It's been frustratingly slow to move that number up, that percentage up.
Right. If you look at that chart again, you'll notice that it's not a steep incline. That it's just kind of creeping along up there.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the facts that we look at. What can United Way do about that? And that's perhaps something that'll take a real earnest discussion with the private sector and ask employers how they stack up and why do they stack up the way they do, and just bring an awareness to that differentiation. And in 2015, there really is no reason that it should be that significant a gap in the earning capabilities of women and men.
And I know from just doing some research that the 79% of earnings for women compared to 100% for men is of white women.
Yes.
So that would even change further if they're people of color, correct?
Yes. Correct. And we've got some data from the American Association of University Women, who took a really extensive look at women in poverty. And across all different segments, we're finding that women are lagging in earning capacity as opposed to men. For example, this is the slide on race, ethnicity, and gender, right? And you can see that the purple bar on the graph is what women are earning in these segments, and as opposed to the green bar, which is what men earn. And across all segments, Hispanic, American Indian, Native Hawaiian, African American, white non-Hispanic, Asian American, women are lagging behind in earning capacity.
And it's somewhat mysterious because, say, a generation ago, the explanation was that there weren't enough women in the pipeline. They simply hadn't been in the workforce long enough to acquire the credentials and the experience necessary for higher level positions, better paying positions. Yet I think you could argue that certainly women have been in the pipeline for the last generation, moving themselves, preparing themselves for these kind of positions, and it simply isn't happening as fast as one might expect.
Okay.
And this next one, to me, is particularly interesting in what it shows, in that early in work careers, as men and women get into the workforce, the wage difference isn't that great.
Right.
It isn't until you get to that age span, maybe 35 to 44, that the gap really starts to widen.
And that's really in the center of our screen. So if you're looking at that would be the columns in the very center.
Right. And I don't know if anybody has come up with a reason why that gap exists. Perhaps it's women who have stayed at home to raise children and gone back into the workforce, and they're starting at a lower salary than their male counterparts are. But it really is an indictment, I think, about what women are up against as a, let's call it what it is. There's discrimination there.
But it's also interesting if you look at this, that it levels out at 35, and it gets a little higher between 55 and 64, but then of course after retirement it goes down, just as the men continue to climb a little
grow.
bit.
Yeah,
Right.
plateaus.
And for women it does plateau.
Yeah.
And here we're looking at the difference in wages according to educational attainment. And if you go look at the far right-hand comparison, people with doctorate degrees, there's a significant difference between men and women, and really it exists all the way along in any educational attainment that we look at. So, and this just supports and documents that women are having a tougher time in the economy, particularly if they're raising a family by themselves. That they are up against some tough odds.
Yeah, I was going to say, but if you look at it, the trend is upward, even though women fall behind men at almost every point. It shows getting an education does bring financial benefits, even though women do lag behind men and seem to kind of reach a plateau at a younger age.
Right. So, and now we have one that actually shows the difference based on the type of degrees or education that a person has, particularly in this case it's women.
Correct, and by ethnicity also it's looking at. So if you look at the far right hand, Asian American women do the best, followed by white women.
And then the colors, so if you have less than a high school degree, that's kind of that orange, yellowish color, I should say. And you see that doesn't get much better over the years. However, if you have the advanced degrees, it does continue to raise. Fairly well, actually.
It's interesting. They're a very consistent pattern.
It is, isn't it?
It is. It just the numbers vary, but that's a very consistent pattern.
So, it became clear to the board that no matter what way we looked at the problem, there was a significant issue that needed to be resolved.
Okay.
So to start the process, we formed a steering committee to kind of keep us on track, offer suggestions, and give us encouragement when we needed it. We continued to do some research, looked at the Shriver report, decided to use the Harwood Institute model of community conversations. We thought that the awareness was a big part of this, and we wanted to bring the community together to discuss the problem. We held a community presentation and discussion about the documentary Paycheck to Paycheck, which documented the life of a young woman trying to raise a family at below the poverty level. We developed a series of questions and identified specific groups that we wanted to bring into the community conversation process. And that gave us just a wealth of data to examine about what the underlying issues were. And this is where Karen comes into the picture, because she's our consultant, and she was the one that really got the community conversations up and running and made sense of this for us.
Okay. And in the meantime, too, we partnered with the university.
Correct.
On the Humans of Oshkosh project, which, if people haven't seen the Humans of Oshkosh project, Grace Lim and her group at the university, a group of students in storytelling for fun and profit class, did a wonderful book, actually, and Facebook page on what it's like to be living in poverty in our community. And then, Karen, with some of the information that you're going to talk about, we actually held a summit. Before, we're going to go into a quick break, but before we do that, Karen, do you want to talk a little bit about the conversations and how those were held?
This was a new model for me. It is the kind of research methodology that is certainly not statistical in nature, but over the course of about 9 months, about that, 22 community conversations were held in the community. They were based somewhat on invitations. The communities within the community were identified, and then leaders were asked to please participate in these.
And keep going. And so how many did we hold?
22 were held. The smallest was 4 conversation.
4 people?
Yeah.
4, okay.
Yes, and size, and the largest was 23 participants at a conversation. So the conversations were pretty wide, different sizes. The average group size was about 11.
Okay. And I think before we continue on, we'll go to a quick break, and then we'll come back and have you finish up with what we learned as a result of those conversations. So stay tuned. So if you want to hear what actually came out about the conversations and what we learned about women in poverty, stay tuned for the second part of our program.
Underneath everything we are, underneath everything we do, we are all people, connected, interdependent, united. And when we reach out a hand to one, we can influence the condition of all. That's what it means to live united.
This year, United Way worked to ensure quality childcare for over 6,500 children in Kansas City. To do so, we coordinated the efforts of 95 providers, 11 partners, and 8 different funders. We helped thousands of families in 8 different counties. But the number of centers and services doesn't really matter. What matters are the children now with a chance and families now with a future.
Hi, and welcome back to our program. My guests today are Stu Rickman, President of the Board of Directors of the Oshkosh Area United Way, and Karen King, who is an independent consultant who actually helped us work on a project related to women, poverty, and economics. In the first half, Stu was giving us the statistics as to why the United Way picked the issue of women and poverty, and particularly single women with dependent children. Mm-hmm. And Karen then was our leader in the community conversations and then the research side of this. So Karen, you started talking about, before the break, you started talking about the community conversations, and so let's backtrack just a little bit.
I'm going to review a little bit. There were 22 conversations held within the community over about an 8-month period, which ended last May. These varied in size. The smallest with one-to-one interviews. There were a few of those, which really contributed a lot to the outcomes, but the smallest conversation, if you want to call it, was 4, and the largest was 23, so there was quite a range, but the average was 11, and that's a nice-sized group that encourages participation by all members. Altogether, there were 239 community participants in one or another of these conversations. These were unduplicated. These were different people. It turned out that the youngest ones were in high school, but they were associated with a college, with a class, so they were, I don't know, 14, 15 years old. But the oldest was 99, and this was a woman in an interview situation who acknowledged that she was. So it was a very large range of ages looking at the same questions and the same ideas. The process was the same for every conversation, even though the groups were widely divergent. In this, each conversation, 8 questions were asked of the group as a whole, and then a trained facilitator led a conversation about these questions, and then a scribe, also a trained volunteer, collected the information on sheets of paper, which were then collated and analyzed, and this is what I did. And there were 20 to 25 different responses per question, so there was a lot of data. There was a certain amount of overlapping, and I'll talk about that, but I will say there was a wonderful wealth of information here that people shared.
So let's talk about that information.
Can I go?
Oh, yes, you may.
I do want this to me now, as a researcher, what jumped out at me was the lack of, one thing, male participants. Now, the sex of the participants was not asked. So mostly it's impressionistic. The names were collected, but nobody said, do you identify as male or female? So we're just going by what we observe, but I would say there are more female than male participants. And the other observation I had, that there didn't seem to be very many business respondents. There were not groups that were centered around people in business. I don't think this was any deliberate attempt to exclude any particular group. I think it is perhaps the fact that those who should participate were not identified carefully. I think there are probably people who felt that if it said women in poverty, it was a group for women to come and talk about the issue with each other, or perhaps businessmen felt that this was poverty was not an issue that they in business encountered. So that might have been part of it. But on a deeper level, I would say that that the fact that men and business people didn't participate as much suggests perhaps that they didn't see women in poverty as a particular problem or concern to them. So I think there's some education necessary on this issue. But what was important, though, the most important part was the data that came out of these 8 questions. First question was, what do you want our community to be like? And this is kind of a visioning question. If we were having relatives come and visit us in Oshkosh, what would we like our community to look like at first glance? What would we want their impression to be of our community? And so the participants in the conversations identified a number of these images, and then I simply did a counting process and came up with those you see that are the most frequently mentioned. I will say every question produced many, many, many more responses than appear on these responses. But clearly, people want their community to be perceived as free of crime. We all want to feel safe. The idea of diversity, I think, is interesting. That not only a diverse community or someplace where diversity is welcomed, as encouraged, I thought was interesting. I think as we go through these questions, you'll see that there's a lot of overlapping. Okay. They don't all appear in the same ranking, but there's a lot of overlapping, and then we address that in another activity later.
And so you really focused this on the frequency that this was mentioned.
Absolutely.
Across conversations.
Yeah. So, for example, free of crime, 20 out of 22 says that in 20 of the 22 conversations, freedom from crime was mentioned. It simply is a frequency. It doesn't rank them in importance. Simply, it's a numerical frequency. Second question was narrowing it down a little bit more. When you think about poverty in Oshkosh, acknowledging that we do have it, what comes to mind? And some of these responses were really very concrete things. That the transportation isn't good. There's a lack of good housing. So you see a number of those, but you also see some that are really have more of an emotional quality or an affective quality. For example, isolation, lack of friends. That deals with a whole other aspect of the experience of being poverty than does lack of a bus route that meets your needs, for example. So you see both. So in some of these shelter limitations, homelessness, people see homeless on the street, they're aware of it, they think of poverty. But then you move down to isolation and lack of friends and family. That's a whole different thing. You can't observe this very easily in the community, but the participants were aware that came to their mind when they thought about poverty in Oshkosh.
I find it interesting, the negative image of the poor and the working class. I mean, to hear that come out in these conversations was quite interesting, and I know that we had a number of individuals who were working class and near or maybe below the poverty line in the sessions.
The intent was to get a broad spectrum in the community, but not to stigmatize people. So there were no conversations that were specifically around people who were poor.
No.
And so you had people in conversations who knew somebody who was, and some who had experienced it themselves but weren't experiencing it now. So certainly this is, you have different groups looking at this. We're giving some of the same responses.
Right.
So then we went to the impact of poverty on the community and moved down to the image and the impact on women. There you get something very kind of emotional, isolation, lack of companionship. Some of this may have been projection. It's like, if I were poor, how might I feel? But some of it probably was people who had experienced it. Concerns about children, you would expect that. Again, the last 9 out of 22, depression, sadness, loneliness, and stress, which deals with the mental health consequences.
Right.
Aside from just the physical ones. Question 4, overall, how do you think things are going when it comes to women in poverty? This produced the widest variation of responses. You know, for some, we're saying we aren't doing enough, it's bad. And for others, it's going in the right direction, better than it was in the past. So the perceptions of how we're doing varied widely.
But if you go back to that graph, 59% to 79%, we haven't moved too fast.
No, that's the not so good part. And actually, that's not as bad as in the past.
That's true.
And this is what I found interesting for the conversations that I participated in, especially for those women who had experienced it. Who had a whole lifetime of dealing with this issue, they said things were better, which seemed to mean more accessible, and they seemed to feel very positive and comfortable with themselves. This whole idea of poor negative self-image didn't show up all the time. Okay. What services or programs do we have in place to support women in poverty? This question produced the greatest response. So the participants identified more than 65 agencies or programs provided at all levels, governmental levels, which are there to help women and their families. I've just identified a few of these that were the highest numbers. And what this said to me was that perception of participants was that the community, whether it's local, state, or federal, is doing a lot to help people, is trying to help these people, and they could name specific ones they did. So from that standpoint, it's kind of a positive picture, is people are aware it's a problem and aware what the services are. So you see all of these are at different levels. So some of the obstacles to addressing poverty in our community, why don't we do more? What could we do? And transportation, some of them are fairly concrete, like transportation, but then we're back to the attitude of public toward the poor, shame, pride, stigma. Again, those hard to grasp, hard to measure concepts that people associated with
And
it.
again, mental health.
And all mental health issues. So we have, what do you think would make, these are general ideas of what people say would help. There was a lot of repetition. Some of it, again, had to do with educating the community, and some had to do with helping the individuals who suffer from it.
Okay.
So you get a range. This was hard. How will we know we've made a difference? There were some concrete measures. I think there was acknowledgement that this can be an intergenerational problem, and measuring it on the short term is difficult.
Okay, so we're in it for the long haul.
Yep. Last question, this was a probing question, the root causes of poverty, and we identify a number of these which certainly align with other national measures of the roots of poverty. Nothing new about that.
So our key findings, we ended up with a couple of topics.
Yeah, the ones we ended up with that showed up with frequency: lack of education. You know, women can't get the kind of jobs they need to have because they can't. And the child care issues, and also other issues that are related to that, particularly centering around child care.
Okay. So Stu, what are our next steps? We've only got a very short time here, so you have to talk really fast.
Well, big problem requires bringing a lot of people to the table, and United Way is going to play a part in asking for the agencies and other groups to collaborate, make some proposals on programs they can put together. We're also collaborating with the Community Foundation of Oshkosh and Fox Cities in Brown County to look at basic needs as a whole, and the slice that the United Way is going to carve out is the women in poverty. So we'll be working with them and studying the problem in a much broader sense in months to come.
And if somebody wanted to act, what could they do?
Well, I think one of the things that is coming up pretty quickly that's going to have an impact on women in poverty is the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit is due to expire in 2017, I believe. So if you really want to have an immediate impact, call your congressman, call your U.S. senator, lobby to have those programs extended, because those once we lose those, then the problem gets more severe.
Okay, well, this is a lot of information. Thank you so much for being here. This half hour flew by, and thank you for watching our program.